Dry day, fine, wet day, manholes burp, treatment plants max and spill, valves open to relieve pressure, and a stew of bacteria, nutrients, and whatever's in street runoff, oil, metals, microplastics, heads straight to beaches and near-shore shallows. Health departments hang no swimming signs before the sky clears. It's not just gross. It's risk, E. coli, viruses, and the hidden stuff that doesn't smell. Microplastics crept up the list while the old poisons lingered. Fibers from laundry, fragments from packaging, microbeads from a phase now banned but not erased. They wash into tributaries and settle into everything. Lab techs cut fillets from popular fish and find specks under the scope. The health science is still catching up, but advisories grow. Limit meals, choose smaller fish, avoid fatty tissue where certain chemicals gather. For families that fish for food, not just Saturdays, advisories aren't a brochure, they're a budget stress. Dredging became the preferred fix. Identify areas of concern, scoop the hot spots, cap what can't be moved, and haul barge loads of toxic mud to line facilities. It works on paper and often works in practice until the next 100-year rain arrives 5 years early. Settled channels shift, caps get undercut. A dredged harbor draws a sigh of relief, then an upstream brown surge delivers a reminder. The watershed writes the last chapter, not the crew with the clamshell bucket. Trust in the tap phrase in that cycle. A family in a downriver neighborhood opens the faucet to a chlorine and metal tang after a storm. The city issues a boil water advisory for a pressure drop tied to a main break, the third this summer. Bills are up because the treatment plant added carbon to handle taste and odor problems from an algae pulse. The mom texts her sister, pick up bottled water. The corner store sells out by noon. Paychecks don't stretch to a home filter. Kids carry refillable bottles from school fountains. Somebody swears are safer. PFAS slides into conversation and won't leave. The so-called forever chemicals used in firefighting foams, stain repellents, non-stick coatings show up in surface water, groundwater, and fish. They don't break down easily. Conventional treatment misses them. Lawsuits fly. States set stricter limits than federal rules. Utilities add new steps, new costs. Ratepayers see another line item, another meeting where engineers explain granulated activated carbon and ion exchange, while residents ask a simpler question: can we drink this? Cleanup meets its match not just in weather, but in money. Sediment projects cost tens to hundreds of millions. Rebuilding sewers costs billions. Old pipes leak. Lead service lines still sit under blocks that never saw the investment others did. Utilities juggle debt ceilings and bond ratings, while neighborhoods juggle late fees and shut-off notices. The map of who pays and who suffers overlaps in predictable ways, where industrial land uses sit next to modest homes, where tax bases are thin, where political clout is thinner. A beach day becomes a roulette wheel. Green flags fly all week, then a thunderstorm turns them red by morning. Parents explain to a 5-year-old why the water he loves is off limits again. In the same county, a golf course sprinkles fairways from a private intake and never posts a sign. This was the moment everything changed, happens in small decisions, compounded. A plant deferred an upgrade, a council delayed a sewer separation, a dairy added a lagoon, a warehouse paved a field. They add up to a brown plume and a closed tap. In the aftermath, communities organize. Church basements host water testing nights. Volunteers pass out pitchers and filters. High schoolers knock doors with flyers about boil orders in 3 languages. City halls launch text alerts and dashboards. It helps, but it's triage. Until the sediments are secured, the sewers separated, and upstream nutrients throttled, the next storm resets the board. Recovery stalls because the system keeps moving. The lakes aren't a museum, they're a conveyor. Wind, waves, and runoff redistribute yesterday's mistakes. The burdens fall heaviest on people with the fewest choices: renters who can't replace pipes, elders on fixed incomes who can't buy filters, anglers who can't switch to costly store-bought protein. And as chemistry and biology falter together, the water itself starts moving differently, whipping between extremes in ways the old playbook didn't anticipate. Climate whiplash, from record lows to record highs. The water started behaving like a mood swing, not a gentle cycle, but whiplash. A decade ago, harbors posted "mind your draft" signs as levels slid to charts nobody under 40 had seen. Dock pilings stuck out like ribs, marinas grounded boats that had never touched mud. By 2013, winter storms blew dust across stretches where charts promised depth. Then, almost without pause, the script flipped. By 2020, waves punched over seawalls designed for another era, flooding streets that once felt safely inland. To understand why, you've got to follow heat. Ice used to lock the surface, capping evaporation through the cold months. As winters warmed, ice cover shrank and arrived later, left earlier. That opened a longer evaporation season. Meanwhile, the atmosphere kept more moisture. When storms came, they came loaded. One year the balance tipped toward extra loss, sun, wind, long ice-free autumns sucking water away. Another year, storm tracks lined up and hammered the basin, dumping rain that swelled tributaries and pushed lakes up fast. The seesaw got a motor. Shipping felt it first, then everyone else. In the low-water years, captains shaved cargo to keep keels off the bottom. Every inch of draft lost can mean hundreds of tons left on the dock. Multiply that across a season, and you're talking real money. Dredges raced across choke points, scraping channels deeper as budgets allowed. But dredging can't chase water that's simply not there. The flip side arrived with the flood years. High water made some channels wide-open highways, but it turned docks into traps. Waves tore cleats from concrete. Fender posts snapped. A good northerly could slam a ship against a pier with a force the mooring plan never contemplated. Homes learned a new language, seiche, the slosh that tilts water from one end of a lake to the other under wind and pressure. A south wind could raise the north shore a foot in hours, then reverse. Breakwalls designed for a certain historic high now met a burst that sent spray over rooftops. Homeowners armored their yards with riprap. Cities stacked sandbags along lakeside roads. Insurance adjusters walked blocks with clipboards, counting warped floors and cracked foundations, then quietly raised premiums or declined to renew. Wetlands, the quiet shock absorbers, got squeezed. When water dropped, invasive plants marched into exposed flats. When it surged, armored shorelines pinched the space wetlands needed to migrate landward, drowning them in place. Those lost acres mattered when the next storm hit. Without them, waves bit harder and nutrients had one less filter before reaching open water. A spring storm became a summer algae edge case in ways that surprised planners. A lighthouse keeper told it simply. One winter, ice shoves cracked the outer wall, and a January gale finished the job, shattering windows and soaking the staircase in brine and spray. Volunteers raised money, repaired, and reopened by summer. 3 years later, the lake sat weirdly low. The marina down the coast had to move slips to the end of the basin and install temporary pumps to keep fuel lines wet. Same shoreline, different crisis, same volunteers passing the hat. Budgets broke under that rhythm. Counties scheduled shoreline work on 10-year horizons. Now they were rebidding every other season. Federal funds arrived in pulses, disaster declarations, emergency dredging grants, but local matches and timelines lagged the water. Engineers presented 2 sets of plans at council meetings, one for lows, one for highs, neither cheap. This was the moment everything changed. Wasn't a thunderclap, it was a spreadsheet. Ports adapted by buying time. Some deepened berths and installed adjustable fenders. Some built floating docks for small craft to ride the swings. Others couldn't. Bedrock sits where bedrock sits. When water ran high, they shut sections during storms to keep workers safe. When it ran low, they staged cargo in smaller bites. Every workaround shaved efficiency. Every shave rolled down supply chains, or deliveries, grain shipments, salt for winter roads. Farmers felt the swing in their fields. In a low-water year, tributaries ran thin, and irrigation demands spiked just as shallow wells coughed up sand. In a high-water spring, tile drains ran full, carrying phosphorus from saturated soils into ditches that poured it straight to the lakes. Planting windows shrank and shifted. Rain that used to fall over a week arrived in 6 hours. The old drainage math didn't hold. City planners rewrote ordinances. New construction near shorelines faced higher elevations and setbacks. Some towns offered buyouts for repeatedly flooded homes and turned lots into public greenways designed to flood safely. Others poured taller walls and hoped. Real estate agents learned a new disclosure cadence, talking through flood histories like school district ratings. Mortgage lenders asked for flood elevations in neighborhoods where nobody had ever bothered. Ice cover decline rippled beyond water levels. Less ice meant more winter wave energy chewing at bluffs. It meant unsafe ice seasons that shortened tourism economies built on shanties and snowmobiles. It meant shipping seasons nudged longer, colliding with maintenance windows for locks and channels. It also meant more open water late into fall, more evaporation, and another nudge toward the next low cycle, unless the storm track loaded the basin again. Planning timelines broke because the reference points moved. The 100-year flood arrived twice in a decade in some basins. The record low was followed by a record high inside a single political term. Capital projects designed to last 50 years met conditions outside their design in 5. People asked for certainty. Engineers offered ranges and probabilities, then watched a freak storm puncture the middle of the bell curve. Legal walls looked solid, zoning, setbacks, permits, until they met a lake that refused to sit inside old averages. That's where the next fight begins. Who gets to build, armor, dredge, or retreat when the boundary between land and lake won't stay still? The Great Lakes Compact, shield or sieve. Legal walls looked solid until the water started breaking every norm in the playbook. That's when people reached for the document they thought would hold. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact. 8 states on one side, 2 Canadian provinces aligned by a parallel agreement on the other. The headline promise sounded simple. What's in the basin stays in the basin. No big pipes out. No cavalier drains to thirsty neighbors. A shield, finally. But law lives in definitions. The compact defined its map, the basin line down to parcels, because hydrology doesn't care about city limits. It carved out special categories too. Straddling communities sit with 1 foot inside the basin, 1 out. Straddling counties include places entirely outside the hydrologic line, but tied politically to a county that touches it. And public water supply purposes covers what counts as legitimate use, not just who turns the tap. Those words would matter more than the banner promise. Waukesha, Wisconsin was the test. The city sits outside the basin's hydrologic boundary, but inside a county that touches it, pulling on a stressed aquifer laced with radium. It applied for Lake Michigan water under the compact's exception for straddling counties, promising to return treated water to the lake watershed and limit the service area. After years of review, the governors approved it, with conditions, tight boundaries, strict return flow monitoring. The message was careful. This is not a door, it's a case-by-case key. Still, a precedent clicked. Then there was the bottled water clause. The compact bans most diversions, but treats water in containers under 5.7 gallons as a product, not a diversion, if withdrawn from within the basin and exported out. It sounds technical. On a loading dock, it's pallets of shrink-wrapped bottles headed to markets far from the lakes. Companies argue the volumes are tiny relative to the basin. Critics argue that once water leaves as a product, it's gone for good. No return flow, no accounting in the hydrologic books. The loophole is legal, and it's real. Enforcement looks tough on paper. Most major diversions require unanimous consent from the governors. In practice, politics pushes on unanimity. States want jobs, companies promise investments. A governor facing drought headlines in another region will take calls. Penalties exist, but they're modest compared to the value at stake in an era when dry reservoirs make front pages. The compact's drafters bet on cooperation, stress tests cooperation. During low water years or bloom seasons that shut intakes, calls get louder. Lawmakers outside the basin float trial balloons, resolutions, op-eds, think tank maps of pipelines arcing east to west. Most die fast. The elevation climb over the Rockies is brutal. Pumping costs stack up. Evaporation loss along a hot, open canal is a leak you pay for forever, but drought changes arithmetic. A 1,000-mile fantasy feels less fantastical when a city's last reservoir shows bathtub rings and a desal plan runs late. Inside the basin, mayors and tribal leaders watch Waukesha closely because it proves something else. The compact is only as tight as its definitions and the willingness to hold them. Public water supply purposes sound civic, households, hospitals, schools, but in an era of giant industrial campuses, the line blurs. A city can extend service to a chip fab or data center outside the basin line if the legal hook fits. Return flow conditions help, but they don't erase pressure. Canada's side runs on a mirror track with differences that matter. Provinces hold a stronger hand than states do relative to their federal government. Ontario and Quebec have their own bans on bulk removals, born from bruising fights in the 1990s over proposed water exports. The memory of those proposals hardened political reflexes, say no first. Still, product language lives there too. And trade agreements hover as a specter. Lawyers argue about whether water, in its natural state, is protected from being treated as a commodity. Nobody wants to test that in court with the lakes as Exhibit A. So is the compact a shield or a sieve? It's both, depending on pressure. As long as basin states and provinces hold the line on definitions, narrow service areas, real return flows, true public uses, the shield holds. The sieve shows where policy invited it: bottled water exemptions, straddling county carve-outs, penalties that assume good faith in a hard decade. The stakes are simple. Drought-era pressure will pry at every seam. If the loopholes become practices, the precedent becomes policy. And policy is hard to reverse once the pipes are in the ground. The West is running out and looking east. While governors passed definitions, a drumbeat from 2,000 miles away got louder. The Colorado River, America's most litigated creek, ran short, not a blip. A structural shortfall baked in by a century of paper promises that exceeded real water. Reservoirs that once looked endless dropped to bathtub rings and boat ramps on dust. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, icons of the West's bargain with aridity, hit levels where hydropower sputtered and emergency rules kicked in. Cities and irrigation districts carved cuts they'd sworn were impossible. Farmers fallowed fields for payments that didn't cover the math. States argued over who owed what under compacts written when the river ran fatter. Junior users stared at shutoff notices, while senior rights holders stared at crop insurance forms. Meanwhile, heat kept rising. Snowpack thinned and melted early. Rivers peaked weeks ahead of the old calendar, then trickled when demand spiked. It wasn't just drought, it was a new baseline. In that pressure cooker, maps started appearing. Op-eds with arrows, statehouse hearings with glossy renderings of pipelines arcing from the Great Lakes to the desert. Some were laugh lines, like a straw across the plains pulling Superior into Phoenix. Others wrapped themselves in feasibility studies. Water boosters talked about swaps, ship Midwest water west, and send Western power east. Engineers rolled eyes at the head lift over mountains. Pumping water uphill that far turns into an electricity bill that never ends. Even a buried pipe leaks to heat and friction. Open canals gift water to the sky. Still, drought makes bad ideas look respectable. Legislatures floated resolutions urging exploration of Great Lakes diversions. Think pieces called the Compact parochial in a national emergency. Comment sections filled with people asking why a region with so much could say no to a region with so little. It sounded moral until you looked at hydrology and law. The Great Lakes aren't a hose you can open and forget. Withdrawals have to return to the basin to keep levels steady. The compact was written because without it, every crisis would arrive with a truckload of pumps. Western cities ran their own math. Phoenix looked at desalination in Mexico, where a Gulf plant could pair with a water swap up the Colorado versus importing from the east. Las Vegas, already a case study in reuse, stretched conservation like an art form. Cash for lawns, strict outdoor use rules, effluent polish to feed Lake Mead again. Import schemes cost in the hundreds of billions, with decades-long timelines and political risk at every border. Desal costs too, but it's local and certain once built. A pipeline fantasy might buy a headline, a desal plant buys control. Even so, the Great Lakes kept showing up in speeches, not because a pipe was imminent, but because the lakes had become a symbol, a national lifeline locked behind regional gates. Midwest leaders answered with a chorus, never. Governors and premiers held joint presses, flexed the compact, promised legal war over any grab. That was the public line. The private murmur was softer. Jobs and deals talk crept in when chip fabs and battery plants pitched billion-dollar campuses. If a city outside the line wanted lake water through a straddling county clause and promised 10,000 jobs, would the chorus hold the same note? Basin communities felt besieged not just by the West, but by narratives that treated their water as excess. A mayor in a small Michigan town read a column calling the Great Lakes America's emergency reservoir and thought about boil orders after storms and rate hikes to replace lead lines. Excess felt like a joke. Meanwhile, Bottled water plants bought land near cold springs and drilled permits through quiet boards. Trucks rolled outbound for stores in states that tweeted about diversions. Export was already happening, just shrink-wrapped and legal. Farm belts in the West added another pressure.